In 20th of July 1969, the whole world was holding its breath. The Apollo 11 astronauts were about to attempt something that no human had ever done before. They were going to land on the moon. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were in the lunar module that they named Eagle, while Michael Collins stayed in orbit above them in the command module. As Eagle began its final descent toward the surface, the mission control team in Houston listened in silence. A single mistake could destroy everything. Just minutes before landing, a small piece of equipment broke off. It was a switch for the engine. The lives of the astronauts and the success of the mission now depended on quick thinking and calm under pressure. Buzz Aldrin pulled out a felt-tip pen and used it to press the broken switch. The engine responded and the descent continued. Moments later, Neil Armstrong looked out at a field of boulders where the computer wanted to land. He took control by hand and guided the module toward a safer spot. With only seconds of fuel left, Armstrong set Eagle down. His voice crackled across the radio, saying the famous words that are remembered to this day. "The Eagle has landed." In that instant, the dream of humanity leaving Earth became real. That night was more than a technical success. It was a moment that touched every person watching from Earth. Some called it the greatest achievement in human history. Yet even as millions cheered, others began to whisper doubts. Could it really be true? Did humans really walk on the moon? In the years that followed, strange stories started to spread. Conspiracy theories claimed the moon landing was faked. Some said NASA staged it all in a studio and pointed to shadows and reflections in the photos. Others claimed the flag could not wave without air, or that the technology was too weak for such a journey. But for the men and women inside NASA, the memory was clear. They had lived the risk, the fear, and the triumph. They had watched their friends leave Earth on top of a rocket, and they had listened as their voices echoed across space. To them there was no doubt. They had done what many thought was impossible. To understand the truth, you need to look back at how the mission began. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in the Cold War. Both sides wanted to prove their power not only on Earth, but also in space. The Soviets had launched the first satellite and sent the first man into orbit. The United States needed a bold answer. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and made a promise. He said America would send a man to the moon and return him safely before the decade was over. It sounded impossible. At that moment, no American had even spent a full day in orbit. But that promise set in motion one of the greatest projects in history. Over the next 8 years, more than 400,000 people worked on Apollo. They built rockets, computers, spacesuits, and life support systems. Every detail had to be tested and perfected. Each launch carried new risks and new lessons. Step by step, they moved closer to the moon. By the summer of 1969, everything was ready. Apollo 11 lifted off from Kennedy Space Center on July 16th. The Saturn V rocket shook the ground as it carried the astronauts into space. For 3 days they traveled through the silent void until the gray surface of the moon filled their window. The plan was simple, but dangerous. Collins would stay in orbit while Armstrong and Aldrin descended in the lunar module. Every stage had to work without error. As they approached the surface, alarms went off in the cockpit. The computer was overloaded. Mission Control checked the numbers and gave the call to continue. The tension grew as fuel ran low. Armstrong's hands were steady as he guided Eagle past craters and rocks. With less than half a minute of fuel remaining, the module touched down. Humanity had set foot on another world. Hours later, Armstrong opened the hatch and climbed down the ladder. The world watched as his boot pressed into the lunar dust. He spoke the words that still echo today. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Buzz Aldrin soon joined him on the surface. Together they planted the American flag and set up experiments. They collected rocks and soil while cameras sent back images that stunned the world. Michael Collins circled above them, waiting to bring his crew home. For 2.5 hours, Armstrong and Aldrin worked in the harsh silence of the moon. When their tasks were complete, they returned to the module and prepared for the journey back. The mission had proved that humanity could reach beyond Earth and survive. The astronauts had to spend about 21 hours inside the lunar module before taking off again. To leave the surface, they needed the ascent engine. Only then could they rise back into orbit and meet the command module where Collins was waiting. When Armstrong and Aldrin returned inside, they noticed something alarming. The small switch that armed the engine had snapped off while Armstrong was stepping out earlier. Without that switch, there was no way to start the engine, and without the engine, they could never leave the moon. They reported the problem to Mission Control and looked for a solution. Buzz Aldrin examined the panel and realized that the circuit only needed to be completed. He reached for a simple ballpoint pen and used it to press into the broken switch slot. The connection was made, and the engine was armed. That small pen saved their lives. When the time came, the ascent engine fired and the lunar module lifted off from the surface. It rose up through the black sky and finally docked with the command and service module. Collins welcomed his crewmates back, and the three of them began their journey home. Before re-entry, they had to separate the service module from the command module. The service module would burn up in Earth's atmosphere, but when the system failed, its thrusters did not push it far away. The astronauts could only watch as pieces of the service module broke apart and drifted dangerously close. By sheer luck, none of the debris struck the command module. The risk had been enormous. President Nixon had even prepared a speech in case the astronauts died on the moon. He wrote that fate had ordained these men to rest in peace on the lunar surface. Thankfully, the speech was never used. The command module entered Earth's atmosphere glowing with heat as plasma surrounded it. The parachutes opened just as planned, and the capsule splashed safely into the ocean. Rescue teams quickly reached the site and pulled the three astronauts from the water. They were alive and well, but the mission had been so risky that precautions continued even after landing. For 2 weeks, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins were kept in quarantine. Scientists feared that they might have brought unknown microbes or viruses from the moon. In the end, nothing harmful was found, and the crew finally stepped out as heroes. Across the world, newspapers carried headlines about the historic landing. Kennedy's promise that America would send men to the moon before the decade ended had come true. It was one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century. At the time, most people believed in the mission without doubt. The moon landing was seen as a victory in the space race and proof of American technology. But soon questions began to rise. Some wondered how it was possible that the landing happened in 1969 just before the decade ended, as Kennedy had promised. Others asked if maybe the real mission had failed, and what the world saw was only a staged show. Conspiracy theories spread quickly. People pointed to the flag that looked as if it were moving, even though there is no air on the moon. They asked why no stars could be seen in the photographs. They studied the shadows in the images and claimed the lighting looked like a Hollywood film set. But scientists and engineers explained each of these doubts. The flag had a special rod across the top to keep it stretched out, and when it was moved, it looked like ripples. The cameras could not capture stars in the bright light of the lunar day. The strange shadows came from sunlight reflecting off the lunar surface itself. One by one, the doubts were answered. Even with clear explanations, many people held on to their suspicions. They argued that if the landing was real, then why did humans never return to the moon again? The truth is that the missions were extremely expensive. More than 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program, and the cost was around $24 billion at that time, which would be over $100 billion today. NASA had originally planned to continue up to Apollo 20, but by the early 1970s, public interest had faded. The Vietnam War was draining resources, and citizens were struggling with inequality and unrest. Many questioned why so much money was being spent on space when problems on Earth were growing worse. Under pressure, politicians cut funding, and by 1972, Apollo 17 became the last mission to the moon. Still, the Apollo program left behind more than just footprints. It pushed technology forward. NASA's demand for microchips drove down their cost and improved reliability. Those tiny circuits soon became part of everyday life in computers and electronics. The leap to the moon accelerated progress for the whole world. Decades passed, and no one returned to the moon. For nearly 50 years, astronauts stayed in low Earth orbit. People visited space stations, but not the lunar surface. This long gap became fuel for even more conspiracy theories. Some said that if it was possible in 1969, it should have been easy to do again. The reality was simple. It cost too much, and there was no strong political will. In later years, American presidents made new promises. In 2017, Donald Trump announced that NASA would send astronauts back to the moon by 2024. Later, he shifted focus to Mars. But NASA kept working and created the Artemis program. The plan was to first test new rockets without crew, and then send humans once again. By the middle of the 2020s, NASA aims to land the first woman on the moon, and also the first person of color. This time the goal is not just to visit, but to stay longer and prepare for future missions to Mars. If all goes well before the end of this decade, we will once again see people walking on the lunar surface. The story of Apollo 11 is remembered as one of the greatest achievements of humankind. It showed what people can do when vision and effort come together. The risks were enormous, and the mission could have failed at many points, yet Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins returned home alive. Conspiracies will always surround great events, but the evidence of the moon landing is clear. Rocks and instruments remain on the lunar surface even today, and signals still reflect from mirrors placed there by the astronauts. The mission was real, and its impact shaped the modern world.